8. Anti-Tank Dog. The most brutal fighting was seen by the Eastern Front during World War II. New tactics had to be developed in order to defend themselves against the German threat, and so anti-tank dogs were trained as a result. The Russians were well known for their ability to mass-produce cheap equipment, and because of the ever-evolving combat from the early 20th century, military tanks were becoming a giant threat. The Red Army came up with a plot to use their foes' advantages against them, and in 1924, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics introduced the use of dogs as military assets on the battlefield. Training dogs seemed easy enough, and they could be used for a myriad of different purposes, such as rapid communication, assisting in combat, first aid, tracking mines, extracting wounded soldiers with the use of sleds, and transporting certain supplies. However, the biggest menace to the Red Army was tanks, and these new military-grade K9s were expertly trained to assist in taking down these metal behemoths. Since this technique was never done before, the Russian army lacked personnel capable of completing such feats. A campaign was started in order to enlist the help of any person with dog training experience, and once they had enough recruits, practice began in Moscow. German Shepherds were the main breed used for this mission because they were so easy to train, and a mine vest was developed to fit on the animal. The initial plan for these anti-tank dogs was to run under enemy tanks and detach mines from their vest, which would be detonated remotely, before returning to their trainers. But as you know, things don't always go according to plan. The new weapons were first deployed around mid-1941, but the dogs were squirmish on the battlefield, having never been around gunfire before, which made it extremely difficult for them to complete their task. The K9s were also trained using Soviet tanks and were not used to the German design, so they gravitated towards leaving mines under the more familiar Soviet tanks instead, which was obviously extremely dangerous for the Red Army. With limited success, the use of the anti-tank dog significantly decreased and completely phased out of practice by 1966. 7. Rotterdam Blitz. During the German invasion of the Netherlands in the Second World War, Rotterdam was highly targeted by aerial bombardment from the Luftwaffe. The prime objective was to break Dutch resistance as well as support the German troops on the ground that were fighting in the city. On May 10, 1940, the first bombing took place, and by May 14th, Rotterdam's historic city centre had been completely destroyed. The terrible event is sometimes referred to as the Rotterdam Blitz, which resulted in the deaths of at least 1,150 people. 711 of those deaths were from the bombing on the 14th of May. On top of the casualties, at least 85,000 residents were left homeless. From the Germans' perspective, they'd done everything they sought out to do, and the bombing was a physical and psychological success for them during World War II. This prompted them to threaten the destruction of the entire city of Utrecht if the Dutch did not surrender. Too many losses and the fear of even more devastation caused the Dutch to sign the capitulation early on May 15, 1940. 6. Sky Troopers. From the beginning of the Nazi regime, the Germans were always fascinated with engineering and science, and they worked tirelessly so that their military was superior to anyone who could oppose them. They used science as a way to control the world they planned to take by force. The Germans' drive to be number one in everything resulted in some seriously terrifying experiments, as well as some absurd technology being developed. However, most Nazi science was focused on the creation of weapons of war. Rocketry was one of the Germans' biggest areas of innovation during World War II. One of the more lesser-known inventions was known as the Himmelstürmer flight pack. This small two-jet engine machine was created by Paul Schmidt, an engineer for the Nazi regime. The main engine was strapped to the back of the wearer to provide upward and forward propulsion, while the second engine used hand grips in order to control stability and direction. Uses for this jetpack were endless. However, they opted for these Himmelstürmer troops to wear normal German military uniforms and carry guns and grenades like any other soldier. Imagine flying figures crossing enemy lines and striking down on unsuspecting victims from the sky. The Allies wouldn't stand a chance, but luckily, Himmelstürmer never actually saw service. The test flights only covered distances of about 50 to 70 meters, 164 to 230 feet, and due to fuel limitations, longer trips weren't really possible. By the flight pack's test phase, the war was turning against the Germans and their resources were running thin. All available soldiers were needed on the front lines, and the Nazis' jetpack fantasy came to a close end towards the end of the war. Did you know the Nazis basically invented the first jetpack? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Code Talkers. During World War II, the US military began to recruit American Indians for secret communication purposes. Since the American Indians were able to speak fluently in both English and their tribal language, they were the perfect candidates to help the US send private communications while on the battlefield. There were at least 14 native nations aiding in the war, including Navajo, Comanche, and Cherokee tribes. During World War II, a dedicated policy was put into place in order to recruit and train American Indian code talkers. In 1940, the US Army was the very first branch of the military to begin recruiting Native Americans in places like Oklahoma. The US Navy and Marines followed in their footsteps and began recruiting just a few years later. The first group to complete training from the US Marines was a class of 29 Navajo code talkers in 1942. They didn't just go through basic training, they also had to memorize a unique military code, mostly using their unwritten language, and they were hidden out of sight in guarded rooms until they had it down. The help of hundreds of code talkers played a vital role in the victory of the Allies in World War II, and the whole program was kept a secret from the public until it was declassified in 1968. For their bravery, Congressional Gold Medals were given to the code talkers in 2001. 4. Itchy powder. Interestingly, itching powder played a small role in taking down German forces during the Second World War. Secret services and British intelligence were some of the best in the business when it came to spying, and they used a number of tactics in order to carry out their dastardly plans. Trickery and deception were used quite frequently, and a lot of the time, Germans were completely unaware of their secret agendas. Their operations would often include an intricate network of spies, advanced technology, double agents, and of course, a good amount of luck. One operation in particular really got under the skin of the Nazi regime, literally. I'm talking about extremely potent itching powder. This dust was developed by the British Special Operations Executive, and it was smuggled into Germany from Switzerland in tins of foot powder. Once across enemy lines, special Allied forces working in laundromats would sprinkle this stuff all over military uniforms, which caused extreme skin irritation. About 25,000 soldiers aboard an enemy Navy U-boat in October of 1943 were hospitalized with cases of severe dermatitis after double agents sprinkled the powder on their bedding, toilet paper, and underwear. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that would have been? 3. World War II Cannibals. Former President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief George H.W. Bush narrowly escaped getting eaten alive after his plane had been shot down over the island of Chichijima in Japan. It was September 2, 1944, when the future president, only 18 years old at the time, served as an officer in the Navy and was sent on a mission to fly in a strike over Japan. He was told to take out an important radio tower on the island of Chichijima, a stronghold that was heavily guarded. Bush, along with 2 other servicemen, were aboard the aircraft when they had to eject themselves to stay alive after being hit by Japanese fire. Luckily, before strapping on their parachutes, they were able to complete their mission and destroyed the communication tower before escaping their burning plane. Bush narrowly escaped the fate of the 9 other soldiers who also had to eject from their planes. He had become separated from the rest of the group and had been picked up by a large American submarine that had miraculously been nearby. It was found out later that the other men had been captured by the Japanese and were tortured, beaten, beheaded, and some of them were even eaten by the enemy soldiers. Apparently, according to The Telegraph, a British newspaper, Japanese officers ate human flesh in small pieces because they believed it was good medicine for the stomach. 2. Sun Gun. A Life magazine article published in 1945 detailed the absurd German plan to build a giant mirror in space in order to harness the power of the sun so they could burn specified focal points on the Earth's surface. In this article, it says that Germany wanted to use this space weapon to burn entire enemy cities to ashes or boil parts of an ocean. The idea originated from Hermann Oberth in 1923, who was a well-known rocket scientist at the time. The weapon was planned to be over a kilometer, 0.62 miles in diameter, and it would have been powered by the sun's rays. A budget was even set at 3 million Reichsmark to develop the weapon, and it was calculated by Oberth that it would take an estimated 15 years to construct the machine. In order to create the Sun Gun, building material would have to be brought to space using rockets so they could be mounted onto the megastructure. The plans for the giant mirror were not discovered until 1945 by the victorious Allies, which said the space weapon would have orbited the Earth at a distance of about 35,785 kilometers, 22,236 miles. Fortunately, the plans were never fully brought into fruition, and if Hitler had things go his way, the world we know today could have been a totally different place. If the Nazi leader had gained access to such space weapons, he most certainly could have gained world domination. In this day and age, the use of such a device has no beneficial use for war or peacetime purposes, and we're very lucky that nothing of this nature has ever been created. 1. Exploding rats. Imagine you're a soldier during World War II and you come across a dead rat. In order to dispose of the disease-carrying rodent, you throw it into the fire to avoid contamination, and instead of the rat burning to ashes, it triggers a giant explosion. Seems far-fetched, right? But this was an actual plan created by British secret agents as a war tactic against their enemies. These so-called rat bombs never actually caused any explosions, and yet they were still considered to be a massive success for the Allies. The Germans actually intercepted the very first shipment of rats on their way to Britain, which caused them to become really paranoid that their country was already infested with booby-trapped rodents. This paranoia caused the enemy to spend a huge amount of money and resources in order to combat the invisible foe. They worked tirelessly to track down this army of deadly rats when, in reality, they never even existed. In 2017, one of these bomb-stuffed rats was sold by a French SOE, Special Operations Executive Agent, by the name of Maurice Ledan, for a total of $1,875. The man had apparently escaped in 1940 from then-occupied France and joined the Allied commando after arriving in Britain. This proves that this plan was a tactic intended to be used during the war. However, Germany caused their own demise, most likely saving Britain tons of money in production and execution. Thanks for watching. Which one of these dark secrets shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.